As we continue to look at where the economy is moving post the second wave, it's important to see what is happening in rural India. Remember, even as the economy contracted over 7.5% last year, it was the agri sector which was the bright spark with a growth of 3.6%. So what's happening right now? Two or three things we have to keep in mind before we delve into this further. At the beginning of the second wave, there was a very real concern that this time round COVID-19 is spreading beyond the big cities and towns into districts of India, into rural areas of India. And it was not clear what impact that would have and whether there was enough medical infrastructure to deal with this outcome. Now, as we have finished off the month of June, it may seem that things were not as bad as was dreaded, at least in the rural parts of the country. Are there signs of revival? Companies that sell most of their products there especially seem to think so. You speak to the tractor manufacturers and they say that things are looking up. There's a record output of crops, wheat and rice this year, so much so that the government has had to impose stock limits. But is all of this adding to a recovery picture? To get a better sense of that, I'm speaking today with Dr. Sachchidanand Shukla, Chief Economist at Mahindra & Mahindra, and Siraj Hussain, former Agricultural Secretary. Thank you so much to both of you for speaking with us today on the show. Dr. Shukla, may I begin by getting your view on exactly how you see the recovery in rural India?
I think the pandemic is still far from over. We are seeing episodes across countries when I look at it globally. And there are multiple threats that remain to growth, right? But what we have seen is a faster than expected regulatory relaxation has led to a significant rebound in activity. So basically, it as fast as it fell, it's come back pretty much at a similar rate. What we're seeing is a phenomenon that we call as fast in, fast out. So I'll just give you some sense of how fast it has rebounded. Now, if I look at the rural sentiments, I'm just trying to look at CMI's Rural Sentiment Index. And that is up around 2% in June after the trough in May. And if I look at the urban index of the same CMI IE survey, it is down 3%. So there is a 5% gap between the rural and the urban indices. A similar story plays out when I look at the CMI's consumer expectation survey, right? Where rural India seems to be more optimistic as compared to urban. If I look at some of these numbers, high frequency data, daily registrations, which is an average of agricultural equipment or implements, including tractors, etc., is up 237% in June as compared to May. So May was the trough. If I look at two-wheelers, which again a lot of people see as a barometer of rural demand, daily registrations are up about 134% in June vis-a-vis May. If I look at rural migration and remittances, which again is a big factor, a lot of activities have opened up across states. And we are seeing not that big a pressure in terms of remittance flows as well. If I look at the monsoon, which is now looking forward, monsoon in June has been, say, 10% higher than the LPA. But the spatial distribution has been quite uneven, with 50% of the country getting excess rainfall. So if I put all of these together, what we are seeing is a fast in, fast out phenomenon playing out in rural. Now, this was inconceivable simply because if you look at the pace of infections, if I compare August to September last year, rural districts accounted for about 2.3 million new cases. And in April, May this year, they accounted for about 7.6 million cases. If I talk about deaths, reported death rates, it was about 28,000 in August, September last year. And this time around, April, May jumped to about 84,000 deaths, reported deaths. So I think this loss of lives coupled with loss of livelihood prospects made everybody very, very cautious. But I'm glad that people are looking ahead in terms of high frequency data or in terms of, sentiment, I think things have improved significantly.
So you talked about two interesting factors. One was sale of tractors or bookings for tractors and two-wheelers to show that kind of growth. Siraj Hussain, let me also get your perspective with these two to one more aspect, which is your record production levels and output of wheat, rice, etc. Is it safe to say that record levels of production and then procurement would directly lead to a boost in incomes and enough of incomes? Because here we're not counting on what's happening in the non-farm sector yet.
Yes, in 2020-21, the monsoon was very good. In fact, the monsoon has been very good in the last 3 years, and therefore there was fortunately recovery in prices also due to global factors, as a result of which the farmers would have realized good income in 2021, and therefore we can say that in many areas where traditionally the procurement was not very strong, for example, Eastern UP, Bihar, etc., Madhya Pradesh also, wheat procurement has been exceptionally good. So I agree that the recovery in rural areas is going to be much faster than what we would have expected, despite the loss of life. And even now, I would just like to add that even now some areas of the country like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, etc., are still experiencing high number of cases. Probably it is due to better testing and better reporting. But even then, my own sense is that after talking to people in UP and Bihar, in rural areas, my own sense is that the Kharif operations are progressing rather smoothly, and we should be fine with the rural demand in the next 1 month or 2 months.
Now let me come back to the question of non-farm part of the rural economy and what's happening there. And Dr. Shukla, is this the part about which would worry in terms of incomes? You talked about the CMI report on consumer sentiment, and yes, rural economy did improve in terms of consumer sentiment from a lower base, but far off to go to, say, pre-pandemic levels. On the other hand, the non-farm section of rural India seems to be in a bit of a pain, whether it's loss of employment, loss of jobs, loss of ability to do their work because of restrictions. And do you think that we're yet to see that aspect play out?
I think when we look at rural, we look at agricultural cash flows, which are sound, which I don't think are a cause of worry as of now. When we look at non-agricultural or non-farm cash flows, those are the segments that have been hit harder this time. And therefore, there are some concerns, especially given the regional variations or state level variations that Mr. Hussain pointed out. So what we're seeing right now is some of the southern states are still reeling under the impact and therefore having to continue with higher level of restrictions as compared to the northern states or the central states. Maharashtra, for example, is again an example that we can look at in terms of activity. Having said that, I think for the non-agri cash flows, one of the most important things that we saw last time is that a large part of the resilience of rural economy, both agri and non-agri cash flows, stemmed from all-out government support by the government, right? Which is free food, gas, front-loading PM Kisan payments, increasing MNREGS allocation, moratorium, etc. Now, this time around as well, I can see a similar approach from the government. I'll just come to what is changing at the margin. So government seems to have changed tack in the current fiscal year, and they are providing support in a targeted fashion. So for example, they have continued the free food rations under Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, and that has been extended till November. They have also surprised most people by increasing the amount of subsidy on fertilizers, roughly 15,000 crore worth of subsidies. We have also seen some supply side measures. I mean, taxes on edible oil have been cut recently. And if required, they can address some of these supply side measures by getting NAFED, etc., to to come in and really help those supply crunches. I think as long as the government continues to play ball and continues to focus on the rural economy, we think the outlook will remain supportive, because government spending and coordination between center and states has been one of the most important factors behind rural resilience. And let's also not forget the point that Mr. Hussain made. I think what you will see is last 3 years in a row, we've had good monsoons, and therefore 6 consecutive good crops, and therefore cash flows and economic activity, etc., remain strong. And as long as the monsoon doesn't really play trond, or the terms of trade don't really deteriorate, for example, the prices of food versus non-food, as long as that doesn't deteriorate sharply going forward, I think rural will continue to do fine, even on non-agri activities, because a lot of states have allowed activities like mining and construction. So what we will see is, what we should be worried about is the regional or state level variations, but not really in terms of direction.
I also want to get a sense of, are we taking into account clearly enough the impact of health expenses on rural incomes? Siraj Hussain, if you could give us some perspective here. So we know that there were more COVID cases in wave 2 in rural India than wave 1. We know also that a lot of these expenses would have piled up onto families. On an average, 62% at least of health expenses are borne out of pocket by families, and doesn't really come in from governments and administrative support. What do you think will be the effect of this additional burden on incomes, even if incomes are boosted by better agricultural output?
Tamanna, we do not have any data, reliable data, to explain the expenditure incurred by rural population on health during the COVID, admissions, etc. But my conversation with people in rural areas shows that they have not really spent too much in hospitalization, etc., because first of all, the facilities did not exist in rural areas for hospitalization, and secondly, the hospitals were full with better off people in urban areas. So the hospitals at, let us say, at the district headquarters were all full. Therefore, the rural people, even if they wanted to get admission, they could not do it. Therefore, my feedback shows that most of the people in the rural areas consulted only the local quack. In many cases, they may be practicing in the village itself, and therefore they did not end up spending as much as the urban poor or urban middle classes spent on hospitalization, etc. Therefore, I do not think that there is a great deal of impact on the very poorer sections of society. It is the middle classes, lower middle classes, etc., living in urban areas who admitted their family members in private hospitals and had to spend a lot of money. So that is my take on this subject, but I will wait for the data to emerge out of surveys. Unfortunately, the government is not coming out with any reliable set of data. It is only the private companies and private NGOs who are generating data.
Yeah, fair enough. Even all of this is us trying to estimate how deep the impact is. Dr. Shukla, you will agree that this is a part of a very grey area when it comes to definitive data out of what is happening in the rural economy. Some of the indicators are, like you said, tractor sales and two-wheeler sales, etc. But let me come to the specific point about how crucial a return of employment will be. We know that consumer sentiment may have improved, and employment for rural India in the month of June has also improved. But do you think to actually get the economy back on track, we will need to see a much better improvement in rural incomes, and how do you think that will happen?
You're right, and as Mr. Hussain pointed out, unfortunately we don't really count the informal sector very well. I'll just give you an example as to how we do it. If you talk about, say, the hotels and restaurant segment of the economy, the GDP, the way the numbers are reported is something like this. So just about 60 odd companies results were available. And we know that in this segment, 55% of the sector is unorganized, right? So just imagine, we are extrapolating results at a GDP level, national statistics level, based on interim results of just about, say, 60 odd companies. Similarly, I can give you examples across these segments, right? Various segments of the economy. So it is correct that we don't really have good, reliable data. It always comes with a lag, and which is why the GDP numbers are revised multiple times over the course of, say, 2.5 years before we get a final number. I would submit, Tamanna, that in terms of employment, what is needed is not so much the rural segment really firing. I think with 3 consecutive good monsoons, with the kind of output that we've had, with the kind of terms of trade farmers have enjoyed over a period of time, I don't really think that employment gains are going to come from the rural economy or the agrarian parts of the economy. The rest of the economy has to really fire. Most of the jobs generated even on the rural side come from construction. Almost 90% of jobs are generated from construction. So I would submit that the underlying GDP growth, which is non-agrarian or non-rural, say, economy, the parts of economy, have to really now fire if we have to generate the requisite number of jobs or the required number of jobs over a period of time. I think some of these services segments need to really come back. And I think we go back to the question on vaccinations. And unless vaccination picks up, unless some of these services segment sectors really pick up, the contact services part and the manufacturing and the construction bits really start firing, I think we'll continue to struggle on things like employment. We have seen this across the world, more so in the emerging economies, especially India, which remains still.
We have to watch this space very closely. We have to see how the rest of the monsoon pans out. But yes, the great procurement numbers which have come out and the great stocks outputs are definitely giving some sort of hope that we will see a bounce back from the rural economy once again. Thank you so much, Siraj Hussain and Dr. Shukla, for joining us today.